So we've got two U.S. ambassadors to Kyiv here, one former, one current. This is Ambassador Pyatt, who is currently the U.S. ambassador here. And we've got former Ambassador John Herbst, who's now from the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, which was involved in setting up this event. And we're glad to have both of you here. I think we're going to start with Ambassador Herbst, and I wanted to ask you what it's like coming back after 8 years. You were here during the Orange Revolution, which was a time when Ukraine tried to reform itself. It's trying to reform itself again, but there's a war going on. Do you think it's going to be possible for Ukraine to push through the reforms that the protesters on the Maidan were asking for when this whole thing started off?
Well, first of all, Ukraine, even at independence, was relatively advanced in having a civil society that was active, and it had, at least at that time, a little bit of influence. And over the past 20 plus years, that civil society has become ever more active and more influential. You would not have had an Orange Revolution back when I was ambassador had civil society not been active. It's become even stronger over the past 8 years, in part because of technological changes. Twitter did not exist 8 years ago. As we saw during the Arab Spring, Facebook and Twitter were major mobilizing forces, and they've been an important factor here. The Maidan in 2013 and 2014 was even more powerful and more able to produce effective change than the Maidan in 2004. So I think there is a new generation emerging in Ukraine that is saying no to the soft autocracy and heavy corruption that has characterized Ukraine in almost its entire independence period. What's not clear, however, is whether the current political leadership has the instinct and the ability to produce the reforms necessary that the people on the Maidan are insisting upon. These folks are all old figures, old by which I mean they've been in power or near power for over a decade. And the people who are demanding serious change that will make Ukraine a modern society, a democratic society, are a generation younger than the people who are currently in power. And it may be that we're going to see some fumbling on the reform front over the next year, 2 or 3, because there'll be an instinct among those who have the power to play the old-style games.
There would be the question from Sabra Iris, who is actually a journalist writing about Afghanistan, Russia, Ukraine, and the world. How can Ukraine counter the propaganda war that has so greatly influenced the mindset in the East? How would you advise them?
The question of communications is a critically important one because of the way in which Moscow has sought to use information as part of its armory, the way in which Moscow has sought to use this information warfare to advance its goal of sowing instability in eastern Ukraine. It's not a coincidence that so many journalists have been taken hostage. It's not a coincidence that the Slavyansk TV tower is now lying in rubble because it's been fought over. It's not a coincidence that one of the first things that these Russian teams have done as they've come into cities is bring digital equipment and take over the radio and the television and switch it all over to Moscow stations. And I don't know if Simon's had the same experience, but I've heard from other American journalists who've been out in eastern Ukraine who describe their fixers and their drivers complaining about how they can't find their old radio stations in the car because of these changes that have been made. So it's a critical issue. It needs to be understood as part of the battle for minds that the government is engaged in. I think President Poroshenko is conscious of this. It's not a coincidence that he was talking long before he was elected about how his first trip, if elected, was going to be to the Donbass, and he made good on that promise. And of course, Danilo has been at the point of the spear in terms of the Ukrainian government's efforts to address these issues. And it's an effort that I would strongly encourage, because I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's misinformation in Europe. You go to key European capitals. I was hosting some German journalists at my house last month, and all of them were talking about how disconnected the narrative that they read at home was from what they found when they came to Kyiv, met with civil society, walked on the Maidan, met with President Poroshenko and the political leaders. And that's ultimately a job for the Ukrainian government.